The Marines reached the top of the hill, and that was when Captain Everett Pope realized he had led his men into a trap. They had just fought their way up a steep coral slope on the island of Peleliu through point-blank cannon fire and machine guns, and taken the crest. And the crest was not the top. Higher up, in the dark rock above them, Japanese positions looked straight down onto the little knob Pope's men now held. They were exposed on three sides. There was nothing and no one behind them. Their machine guns were broken, their water was almost gone, and the ammunition was running low. Pope had about a dozen men still able to fight, and the sun was going down. What happened on that hill over the next several hours is one of the most desperate small unit fights in the history of the United States Marine Corps. His name was Everett Pope. He was 25 years old, and he commanded what was left of Company C of the 1st Marines. What was left is the important part. Company C had come into the Peleliu campaign with something like 235 men. By the time Pope led it up this hill, days of grinding combat had cut it down to roughly 90, and now, holding this exposed coral knob as the light failed, even those 90 were being whittled away by the fire pouring down from the higher ground. Pope did the arithmetic every commander dreads. He could not go forward, he had been told to hold, and going back down the way he had come, in the open, would be slaughter, so he would stay and hold, with what he had, through the night. Understand what hold through the night meant on that hill. Pope's men were on bare coral, which cannot be dug into. You cannot make a foxhole in solid rock, so there was almost no cover. They were surrounded on three sides by an enemy on higher ground who knew the terrain intimately, and they did not. It was pitch dark, and the Japanese defenders of Peleliu were among the most disciplined and determined the Marines faced anywhere in the Pacific. They did not make the reckless mass charges of earlier battles. They came in the dark, in organized rushes, probing for the weak point again and again and again. Against all of that, Everett Pope had a dozen exhausted men, a dwindling pile of ammunition, and the flat refusal to give up the hill. And the ammunition did run out. That is the heart of this story, the thing that makes it almost impossible to believe. Through the first hours of the night, Pope's Marines beat back rush after rush with rifle and grenade, and each time they fought one off, they had less left to fight the next one with. The pile of cartridges shrank. The grenades ran down to a handful, and then to none. A dozen men on a rock in the dark, attacked from three sides by an enemy that kept coming, and, one by one, their weapons fell silent, not because the men were hit, but because there was simply nothing left to load. Most units, at that point, are overrun. What Pope's men did instead is the reason he wears the Medal of Honor. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. They fought with the hill itself. When the bullets were gone, Everett Pope's Marines picked up rocks, chunks of the coral they were standing on, and threw them. They threw empty ammunition boxes. And here is the detail the survivors always came back to. They threw rocks and their last few grenades in alternation, deliberately so that the attackers in the dark could never be sure which was coming, whether the thing arcing toward them was a stone they could ignore or a grenade that would kill them. A dozen men, out of ammunition, keeping an enemy at bay with a bluff made of rocks. When the Japanese closed the final distance and came in among them, the Marines fought with their fists, with knives, with rifle butts, with anything a hand could grip. It got as close as a fight can get. When attackers reached the very edge of the little perimeter, in the dark at the lip of the coral hill, Pope's Marines grappled with them hand to hand and threw them bodily off the cliff. That is not a figure of speech. On a knob with sheer drops on its sides, men who came over the edge were met and hurled back over it. Pope himself, years later, described the whole thing with a kind of stunned understatement. It sort of turned into a brawl, he said. A brawl. The word is almost comically small for what it was. A handful of Marines, out of ammunition, on a rock in the middle of the Pacific, fighting for their lives in the dark with stones and fists in their bare hands, all night, and not breaking. Think about that night from the other side of it, too. The Japanese soldiers attacking Hill 100 were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were skilled, determined troops who had turned all of Peleliu into a fortress, and by every rule of war, that little group of Americans on the exposed knob should have been finished in the first hour. They attacked, and were thrown back. They attacked again, and were thrown back again, by rifle fire, then by grenades, then, impossibly, by rocks and fists. Whatever they expected to find when they finally rushed that crest in the dark, it was not a dozen out-of-ammunition Marines who would rather fight them with bare hands than yield a yard of coral. The hill held because the men on it simply would not accept that they had lost it. Dawn came, finally, over Peleliu, and the men still on Hill 100 were still on Hill 100. They had done the thing that could not be done. They had held an exposed, surrounded, ammunitionless position through an entire night of continuous attack. But holding it had cost almost everything. In the grey first light, Everett Pope looked around at what was left of the company he had led up that slope the afternoon before and began the terrible accounting of who was still alive. And it was then, with the hill held, that the order finally came, an order that made the whole impossible night, in the cold logic of the battle, almost beside the point. The order was to withdraw. With the coming of daylight, the position that had been merely deadly in the dark became completely untenable. The higher Japanese guns could now see everything, and there was no way to reinforce or resupply the hill. So the same commanders who had sent Pope up were now, correctly, pulling him back off. Everything the men had endured through the night, the rocks, the fists, the friends lost in the dark, had bought a piece of ground that was about to be given up. That is the brutal, unsentimental truth of a battle like Peleliu, and Everett Pope, a clear-eyed man, understood it perfectly. He gathered the survivors to come down off Hill 100, and the number of survivors is the thing that tells you what the night had really been. Of the roughly 90 men who had held that crest at dusk, about 8 walked down off the hill the next morning. 8, let that land for a moment. A company that had come to Peleliu 235 strong and had been ground down to 90 by the days before sent 90 men up that hill, and about 8 came back down. The rest were killed or wounded on that corral through the night. Everett Pope had held the hill, and in holding it he had watched almost the entire remnant of his company be destroyed around him. He came down off Hill 100, having done everything the Marine Corps could possibly ask of an officer, and having paid a price that no medal can really speak to. And there is a final quiet detail about that hill that says everything about how savage the fighting on Peleliu was. After Pope's survivors came down, the Japanese held the high ground around that knob for a long time yet, and the battleground on across the island for weeks. It would be nearly 2 weeks before the Marines could fight their way back to that spot and recover and bury the men who had died holding it through the night. For 2 weeks, the Marines who had fallen on Hill 100 lay where they had fought, because the battle was too fierce and the ground too contested to reach them. That is the reality behind the clean phrase, "he held the hill." It is not a clean thing at all, which raises the question that hangs over this entire story and over the whole battle. What was it for? Why were Everett Pope and his men dying by the dozen for a coral knob on an island most Americans had never heard of and have never heard of since? To answer that, to understand what Peleliu was, why it was fought, and why the cost of hills like Pope's has been argued about ever since, we need to step back from that one desperate night and look at the battle as a whole. And we need to look, too, at the almost unbelievably unlikely man who did the fighting. Before we widen the lens, stay for a moment with the men themselves, because it is easy to say 8 came down and move on, and they deserve better than that. If this is the kind of history you want told with care, subscribe. Keeping these men from being forgotten is the entire reason this channel exists. The Marines who held Hill 100 were not supermen. They were tired, frightened, ordinary young Americans who had already been fighting for days, who were out of water and nearly out of ammunition, and who had every reason in the world to break when the last cartridge was gone. They did not break, and the thing that held them together on the coral in the dark was not hatred, and it was not glory. It was each other, and it was the man in command who would not leave. Everett Pope was that man, and what he did as a commander that night is the quiet center of the Medal of Honor he would receive. He held 12 men and 1 wounded officer together on an impossible piece of ground through hours of continuous attack, as their means of fighting dwindled from bullets to grenades to rocks to fists, and he kept them a unit, kept them fighting, kept them from the panic that would have ended them all in minutes. Leadership in the abstract is a word on a plaque. Leadership on Hill 100 was one 25-year-old keeping a dozen exhausted men from coming apart while the world tried to kill them all night in the dark. That is the thing the medal is really for. And that is what makes the man himself so surprising, because nothing about Everett Pope's background said the last man standing in a knife fight on a coral cliff. He was, of all things, a scholar and an athlete of the gentlest kind, a college man, a French major, an academic prize winner, a tennis captain. If you had met him in 1940, Marine Corps legend is close to the last phrase you would have reached for. And yet here he was in September 1944 on Peleliu, doing something so far outside the range of ordinary human experience that his own description of it, a brawl, sounds like a man who has not yet found the words. To understand how the tennis captain ended up on that hill, we have to go back, and we have to start with the battle that put him there. So let us widen the lens all the way, and look at the thing whole, at the Battle of Peleliu, which the American commanders promised would take a few days, and which instead became a 2-month nightmare that killed and maimed men by the thousand. At the argument, which has never really ended, over whether that island needed to be taken at all, and at Everett Pope himself, the Bowdoin College tennis captain from Massachusetts, who walked into that meat grinder and came out of it, improbably, alive and a legend. This is the context that the night on Hill 100 sits inside. The Battle of Peleliu began on the 15th of September 1944, when the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on a small coral island in the Palau Group in the Western Pacific. The purpose was to secure the island's airfield to protect the flank of the coming American return to the Philippines. The Marine commander, General Rupertus, told his men the operation would be quick. A few days, he predicted, rough but short. He could not have been more wrong. Peleliu turned into one of the longest and most savage battles of the entire Pacific War, grinding on for over 2 months. The Japanese had abandoned the old tactics of meeting the Americans at the water's edge. Instead, they had honeycombed the island's coral ridges with hundreds of caves and bunkers, and they intended to make the Marines pay for every yard. It got as bad as anything in the Pacific. The coral ridges at the island's heart, a maze the Marines came to call Bloody Nose Ridge, had to be taken cave by cave, hill by hill, in appalling heat, against an enemy who fought nearly to the last man. Everett Pope's regiment, the 1st Marines, was so badly cut up in the first week that it effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force and had to be pulled off the island. Hill 100, where Pope made his stand, was one knob in that murderous maze. And here is the part that has haunted the memory of Peleliu ever since. Many historians have concluded that the island did not need to be taken at all, that the airfield proved of little value, that the campaign it was meant to support could have bypassed Peleliu entirely, and that thousands of American and Japanese lives were spent on a battle that changed almost nothing. Into that battle walked one of its least likely heroes. Everett Parker Pope was born in 1919 in Milton, Massachusetts, and he was, by any measure, a brilliant young man. He went to Bowdoin College in Maine, where he graduated with high honors, was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, majored in French, and captained the state champion tennis team, a polished, cultured New Englander bound, you would think, for a quiet professional life. He graduated in 1941 with the world on fire, and instead of that quiet life, he joined the Marine Corps. By September 1944, the tennis captain from Bowdoin had already fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, and was a combat-hardened company commander on Peleliu, the man who would spend a night on a coral hill throwing rocks and fists at the Japanese army. So hold all of it in your mind at once. A battle the generals promised in days, and that took months. An island many now believe never need taking. A regiment destroyed in a week. And a Phi Beta Kappa tennis captain from Maine holding a rock in the dark on a nameless coral knob, keeping a dozen men alive with stones and bare hands. Knowing all that, the night on Hill 100 stops being a simple tale of heroism and becomes something deeper and sadder and more human. Extraordinary courage, spent without stint, in a place that may not have been worth the price, by men who did their duty magnificently anyway. That is the truth of Everett Pope's war, and what he did with the rest of his life is its own quiet answer to it. On the 15th of June 1945, Captain Everett Pope stood at a Medal of Honor ceremony and received the nation's highest award for valor for what he and his men had done on Hill 100. The citation describes the assault under point-blank fire, the exposed hill, the 12 men and 1 wounded officer, the continuous attacks from 3 sides, and the hand-to-hand fighting through the night. It is one of the relatively few medals of honor that turns, explicitly, on men fighting with nothing left but their hands. Pope wore it for the rest of his life, with the particular discomfort of a thoughtful man who knew exactly how many better men had died on that hill to put it around his neck. He never mistook the medal for the point. The men were the point. And then Everett Pope did the most quietly remarkable thing of all. He went home and lived an ordinary, decent, useful life. He left the Marine Corps, went into banking, and became, in time, a bank president, a solid New England businessman, a husband and father, a man you might have stood behind in line without ever guessing that he had once spent a night on a Pacific island throwing men off a cliff to stay alive. He carried Peleliu quietly, as that generation tended to, and he lived a long time. Everett Pope died on the 16th of July, 2009, his 90th birthday to the day. The tennis captain who became a legend on Hill 100 got the long, full life that almost none of the men who held that hill with him were given. Captain Everett Parker Pope of Milton, Massachusetts, Bowdoin man, tennis captain, French scholar, Marine, and Medal of Honor recipient, led about 90 men up a coral hill on Peleliu on the 19th of September 1944. Held it through a night of continuous attack until his ammunition was gone and his Marines were fighting with rocks and fists and bare hands, and came down the next morning with about 8. He lived to be 90 years old, and he never forgot a single one of them. Somewhere the descendants of the 8 who walked down off Hill 100 are alive today. The dozens who did not walk down have no descendants at all, only the memory that a channel like this one exists to keep. When the ammunition ran out on Hill 100, the fight did not stop. The Marines simply picked up the hill itself and threw it at the enemy, and when that was gone, they used their hands. Everett Pope called it a brawl. History calls it one of the most desperate stands the Marine Corps ever made. Both are true. And the lesson of that coral knob is the oldest one there is, that when everything has been taken from a man except the will to keep fighting for the people beside him, that alone can sometimes be enough to hold the line until dawn. People still argue about Peleliu, whether that island ever needed to be taken, whether the courage spent there was honored or squandered by the men who ordered the battle. Maybe you have a view. But whatever the generals got wrong, the men on Hill 100 did their part perfectly, and most of them never came home to be thanked for it. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family fought on Peleliu, or served with the 1st Marine Division, or was a Marine anywhere in the Pacific, in any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who held the hill deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.